Good evening and welcome to another episode of Dana Being Dana. I am your host, Dana Michelle, and we are celebrating 50 years since we've lost Martin Luther King. And we want to talk about, we're not really celebrating, but we're acknowledging 50 years since he passed. And we want to talk about where we are today and how far we've come or not. I've got esteemed members of the clergy and pastors here, friends of mine, to talk about this very important topic on the anniversary, 50 years after Dr. Martin Luther King passed.
Yeah, it's helping our congregants take a look at matters of justice and how it affects not just us individually, but how it affects us in a communal sense. So matters of justice in and around poverty, in and around all kinds of isms, racism, homophobia, etc. And so really kind of looking at that as the text, the biblical text, and understanding our responsibilities in relationship to justice.
Many of the tenets that you're talking about are dovetail perfectly with what Martin Luther King stood for. And so we're going to get into that shortly. Pastor Paul.
Yeah, I'm Pastor Paul Carlson. I'm a visitation pastor at St. John's Lutheran Church in Joliet, Illinois. I'm retired. I was a pastor for 40 years, and I've been retired for 3. And I have been involved in social ministry and social justice. Advocacy ministry is a big ministry that I take part in.
Yes.
And enjoy.
And your wife, Dr. Sandy?
I'm Dr. Sandy.
You're a regular on Dana Being Dana. Thank you so much for joining us.
I am.
Thank you for being here.
I'm always surprised when you invite me back. Involved as a therapist in justice issues, and was 13 years old when Dr. King died, and he had a profound influence on my life and my desire to work for peace and justice.
You guys have been very active, and we're going to look forward to hearing more about that. Reverend Deere.
Yes, good evening. Deere. I'm at DuPage AME Church. I'm also on the National Board of Directors of the NAACP, former president of the DuPage County branch of the NAACP. I have been involved in social justice and civil rights and advocacy probably for the last 25 years. It is what I eat, breathe, think, and sleep.
Yes. And I'm just so happy that you all are here. Thank you so much for joining us. And last, but certainly not least, from Operation Push, the senior advisor to Reverend Jesse Jackson, Reverend Jeanette Wilson. How are you this evening?
I'm fine.
Thank you so much for joining us. Would you like to say a little bit about you and the work that you do?
Well, I am. I wear 2 hats. I am senior advisor to Reverend Jackson, Jesse Jackson at the Rainbow Push Coalition, and as a part of that, work with the Ministers Division of the 1,000 Churches Connected, and we implement some of the initiatives of Rainbow Push. And then I'm the National Executive Director of Push for Excellence. And so that's the educational entity that deals with scholarships and pushing students to higher education to complete elementary and high school with high scores, good grades, challenging students to engage in STEM education, to excel in education at every grade level.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for joining us via phone.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And thanks to everybody for sharing the show. I think this is a message that needs to be shared with many people about Martin Luther King, who he was, and where we are today. Before we begin, I just want for the evening, GH Private Wealth Management. Their number is 800-558-9769. Once again, GH Private Wealth Management Incorporated, 800-558-9. So let's jump right in. We're going to talk about his life. We're going to talk about his legacy, and we're going to talk about our social responsibility in keeping the dream alive. So I want to start off with talking about like setting the stage before Martin Luther King passed this day 50 years ago. Some of you were alive, some of you were older, younger, little tykes. A little bit about Dr. Sandy, you said you were 13. Can you talk a little bit about, and you guys have to share the mic, what it was like, during this at this stage, who weren't. It's so relevant that oral history is so important, and to talk about, what it was like.
What I remember was being very young and watching him on television and being really enthralled with what he had to say. He was such a gentle soul, it came across. And the day he died, it was the same feeling as when Kennedy died, when President Kennedy was shot, was as it was a really painful time. And then 2 months later, with Robert Kennedy's death, now it seems wacky, but looking back on those days, it was a tough time to go through all those assassinations. But I think with King, he touched and I knew in my heart that he was speaking the truth. Just, you could feel it when he talked. And I was raised in a home. My parents were very supportive of Dr. King. And it was really difficult for us when he died.
Yeah, I was 19. In college, my sophomore year of college. At that point, facing the draft for Vietnam, I remember very much. I appreciate anyone that opposed the Vietnam War, because that was just part of our lives at that time. I had several friends that had gone to Vietnam. I did not not like the war. I did not like that concept. It didn't fit with my own as well. And so I was, and I remember the night that Dr. Martin Luther King died. I was on a choir tour. We were, I don't even remember what town it was, but ready to go to sing a concert. And all of a sudden, this news came on that he was shot. And it was just a pall thrown over the whole thing. We ended up singing that night, but it was hard. It was very emotional to go do something. And then when all the riots started, and we weren't them, but they were just riots all over everywhere, it seemed, as we were driving in that bus from one town to another doing a concert. Every time we would get more news. We didn't have cell phones at that time. We didn't have televisions on the bus, but every time we'd stop, we'd find out something else about what was going on, and it just seemed like apart at that point. And there was just chaos.
I think it's important, young listeners,
right,
to appreciate one in Martin Luther King's life leading up to his death, because we don't know what terrorism is today. The Kings lived through, and it was a life that was filled with not only constant threats, beating. They were subjected to, tear gas and hosing and I mean, you name it, subjected to it, being mobbed by crowds and, crowds walking up to with ropes threatening to hang them. I mean, so, they're leading up to his death. Something unimaginable, even something that we don't see today. And so it is incumbent upon, our particular to know what led up to the death. It was not like he went up to the Lorraine motel and there were, months, years of protests. There were speeches. The fact that, he and Coretta were coming against the Vietnam War, along with those things related to economic access and equality. Those things combined were sort of like the catalysts that people from a place of anger to placing him in the crosshairs for an assassination. And even as I described the tear gas and hosing and the threats and the bombings, I feel like I'm still doing a disservice in describing what was going on at that time, because it was so intense and the Kings were constantly moving from one house to another for their own safety. And this is when little Yolanda Yoki, as they called her, she was still in a bassinet.
Yeah.
I would echo, Reverend, when we talk about what we believe or what we thought, how we felt. While I was very young when he was assassinated, I think the state sanctioned terrorism, and I think that's what it really was, right?
I like that. State sanctioned terrorism, right?
It decades after decades. My parents, South Carolina, so even as late as maybe 10 or 15 years ago, when I took my own children to South Carolina and it grew dark, all I could think about was, we got to get out of here before we get lynched. That stayed with me. We got to get out of here before something happens. So really right. This terroristic kind of psyche that we developed over time is a part and parcel to how we to a conclusion for Dr. King. And so because it came to a conclusion in its most finite way, then how are we to believe that would not happen to us?
And you talk about state-sponsored, and also the FBI was after him, and he's considered an enemy of the state. They had files, they surveilled him. Later, as I was older and really understood the implications of that, I was appalled. Just he would be viewed that way. I couldn't understand it.
As such a pillar of peace, nonviolence, unity, freedom, jobs, empowerment was seen as a, according to the FBI.
And we cannot underestimate, and I think this needs to be spoken and heard, we cannot underestimate the power of Black people at that time, because Black people for 13 months decided that they would participate in the bus boycott. And for 13 months, who didn't have social media, didn't have money, etc. These were people that did domestic work. And actually, let me say this also, it was the women, the Women's Political Council, I think is what it was called, who called the boycott.
Right.
And it was initially to be for one day. But it was the Black people that were getting on the bus, taking the bus to these various white homes to, clean homes, take care of children, etc. Thousands of them decided to no longer ride the bus. And they walked for 13 months. We're talking seasons here. In the snow, in the rain,
and what Reverend Deere is talking about, and I think we've kind of touched on it, is an economic concern, right? So it was fine when they were not taking the bus, because there was this kind of impact. While it was not small, I think it was resolvable, right? But when you start having a discussion about redistribution of wealth, then that becomes the conversation that becomes dangerous. That is the conversation that really, as Reverend Deere said, put him in the cross hairs of terrorism. Because it's okay, we'll let you move to, you can boycott for 13 months. We took an economic hit because we didn't receive your fares. We'll negotiate that. We'll let you move up to the front. But now you want to talk about having equal pay for equal jobs. You want to talk about how you are, in fact, equal enough to have the same job. Now you're a problem.
Yeah. And so, and thank you for accentuating that, Reverend Valerie, because one of the things that I want to emphasize, again, especially for our young listeners, is the power and the resiliency of the human spirit. Because for 13 months, with no violence, this was a nonviolent boycott. Folks decided that they would no longer ride the bus, but instead walk. The masterful mobilization by Dr. King was phenomenal, because once they realized that there would be all kinds of political back channels taken to sort of subvert their actions, then Dr. King organized this entrepreneurial transportation infrastructure to get Black people back and forth to work. And to Reverend Valerie's point, and then when he eventually switched his message, or married his message of racial justice with economic justice, then that became a serious problem. Because when they were in Memphis, talking about those rights that garbage workers demanded, sanitation workers demanded, it was a serious problem then.
Right. One of the things that we've touched on that I want to emphasize is the sense of community. Because I remember growing up, and I was born in the late 70s, but I spent time with my grandparents in Virginia, in Norfolk, which was a naval community. And what I appreciated, and I remembered community in that area. The neighbors knew who I was. Somebody was always telling me, I'm going to tell your grandparents, or they were telling me themselves, you can't do that. Don't do that. By the time I got back to my grandparents' house, they knew what I had done or hadn't done, and what I appreciated it then was the sense of community. And obviously I had to study the civil rights as opposed to living them. But what I appreciated was how people saw each other and supported each other. That spirit you're talking about, the resiliency. People gave people rides to get to work. We're going to do this boycott, and you're going to get to work because I'm going to take you. Strangers were helping strangers. There was a real sense of community. And I think that that's one of the things that I'm disappointed to feel like it's missing in the society that we live in today. We don't look out for each other as much as we used to. You see people who know each other at a restaurant on their cell phones, right? And these people know each other, but strangers helping strangers. And that's one of the things that I want to encourage people on this show. And I appreciate everybody for sharing this message, because I think it's so important to know, I want people to start showing up for each other more, and outside of your own realm, outside of your own comfort zone. Neighbors need to start looking out for neighbors like we used to.
Yes.
Because I think that that's so important. And I think that is part of the backbone and why the civil rights movement was as successful as it was. It could not have been successful without people stepping up and showing up. That there was such a less of individualism and much more communal. Do you feel like that? Yes, Reverend Wilson.
I think there are a couple of things that we're talking about. The 50s and then the 60s. The Montgomery bus boycott was when Dr. King went to become the pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And because he was such an articulate spokesperson, he was able to motivate the people and to really push them towards that bus boycott. And then you fast forward to the 60s. By this time, Dr. King had gained visibility and prominence. You had Breadbasket in Chicago and in Cleveland, Ohio. You had the voter registration and civic education campaigns led by Septima Clark and Dorothy Cotton in the South. He had really built up the Southern Christian leadership movement, but he didn't have a large following. By the time we get to 68, there were a lot of people who were not with Dr. King. Many clergy who celebrated him in death did not work with him in life. He was put out of the National Baptist Convention. There were churches in Chicago, J.H. Jackson. They would not let Dr. King in the pulpit.
Do you want to
there
talk?
were only five congregations he could visit before he died in the city.
Do you want to talk about why?
Because they did not agree with his social justice stand. They did not agree with his stand against the war in Vietnam. They were unwilling to challenge the late Richard J. Daley in terms of his practices here in the city, the slum conditions that many Black people lived in. But you had 5 churches that Dr. King could go to where he could get support. Arthur Griffin, First Baptist on the west side, and Dr. Shelvin Hall on the west side, Stroy Freeman, Gordon Humphrey, Reverend Clay Evans, and those were the churches on the south side. So it wasn't the kind of unity that one would think. There was a unity among some of the people, but it was not as large a group. I mean, people used to run television to listen to Dr. King speak. They were not willing to take the stand and follow him and protest with him. And by the time of his assassination, he was not the most popular and celebrated man that he later became in death. His approval ratings had gone way down by the time of 1968 when he was killed on that balcony. And so oftentimes people, they say they were with Dr. King. They were not marching with him in 68. They were with him when he died in 68. Oh, I was with Dr. King, and now 50 years later, they have this memory of him that was not true.
Mm-hmm. And of course, Dr. Will's absolutely right. But there was another faction that was against Dr. King, and that was the Black nationalists.
Yes.
Even, as he stood with the sanitation workers, he said, and Coretta certainly corroborated this in historical accounts, that when he went to, Memphis to support the sanitation workers, the one thing that he was surprised by, no one told him about this wrinkle, if you will, this curve that was being thrown, the fly in the ointment that was the Black recognition. They wanted to drive the agenda, etc. This was one of those marches of which he expressed both concern and surprise that no one told him that this faction was like counter narrative to his agenda or to the people's agenda.
Right. And I want to talk about that. Black Power was the rallying cry of the Black Panther Party. And it came about during the time of the Meredith March, which was James Meredith, the first Black student at the University of Mississippi, he was shot by whites and seriously wounded working on a voter registration drive. And when he was shot, the Black Panther Party wanted to use, and it was the beginning, that's when the Black Panther Party was forming, rallying cry of Black Power. And KLC refused to endorse that slogan. out of fear that it would alienate the white sympathy. I wanted to talk about that and whether or not you feel like when I was reading about this, I immediately thought about Black Lives Matter. Do you feel that has the same reaction?
Well, I think the difference between the nationalist, he operated out of the Judeo-Christian ethic. He was at all times a Christian, and he never left his Christian upbringing and his theological understanding of the Word of God. And so he remained consistently nonviolent. And there was this tension at the time between those who were not willing to follow a completely nonviolent path of resistance. And they just could not understand how one could face so much violence. The dogs, the water hoses, and at a time when even the police were not on. Dr. King and those faced serious personal and emotional, physical and emotional violence in ways that I'm not sure even the Black Lives Matter groups, they're not facing that kind of threat of physical and emotional harm today. They're marching under color of law. When Dr. King and others marched across at Edmund Pettus Bridge, or they marched around the country, they were not marching with full protection of the legal forces that existed at the time. I mean, the president had to send the National Guard to protect marchers. And remember, Dr. King was hit right here in Chicago with a brick in Marquette Park and then Gage Park.
And, we also have to, one of the reasons that Dr. Martin Luther King was philosophically opposed to a message of Black power exclusively is because there were a lot of white people supporting the protests, funding when he was bailed. There were Jews that were in this march. So, it would not have been the right thing to do or the humanitarian thing to do. And that's who Martin Luther King was, a humanitarian, and his cause was for all people, Black people, even though Black people were probably, adversely affected the most and the worst. But, he of saying, what affects one of us directly affects all of us indirectly.
Absolutely. And I've explained that too in the context of Black Lives Matter, right? I think we all understand and have probably explained it too, that doesn't, just because you are pro-Black doesn't mean you are anti-white.
Right.
You're not anti anything. It's just when a group has been disenfranchised, you can be pro-woman and not be anti-man. Just because you want women to have equal rights, to be treated fairly, to not be abused, to not be touched at work, to not be mistreated, to be paid equally. That doesn't mean you want any less or any harm to come to men. And I think that that's the fear that the powers that be or other people would want us to be and plant those seeds. But I want to make that clear and make sure people understand, just because you want other people to have doesn't necessarily mean you're trying to take from others. Do you think Martin Luther King was a socialist? And just to explain socialist, or the term, it's a means of production, distribution, and exchange that it should be owned, or believing that it should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. Not everybody studies socialism. I'm not sure what they study in these schools these days. But do you feel like Martin Luther King was a socialist?
See, I come to the point of saying that Martin Luther was a Christian, and in that Christian sense, there is that community of Christ, the community of people that support one another. And if that is socialism, then I believe he was a socialist. That we have all of these gifts to share with one another, and if in doing that, we can bring other people up and pull others up. That's
lift as we climb.
Lift as we climb. Then that's socialism. I know sometimes the terminology gets to be more negative.
They try to spew it as derogatory. You hear things like communism.
Right.
I think that Dr. King, as he said, once you understand the Christian faith and you genuinely embody that, he believed in Christianity. And I think that if one believes in the Christian principles and the love of God, and I'm only as good as my neighbor is, and if my neighbor is in trouble, then I am in trouble. That whole concept of community, the Christian community and the beloved community, then you see if my neighbor is sick, then I am sick. If my neighbor is homeless, then I am homeless. That those principles are not socialist principles; they're biblical principles, and therefore I have an obligation to make sure that my neighbor is whole, because if not, I am not whole.
So I'm going to agree, but I'm going to push against that.
Okay.
Not that I don't agree. I agree. But if in fact that is the case, and we are a body of Christ, then what in the world is happening? Why do we operate even in our churches individualistically? Sermons are oftentimes meant to rally up people from the individual perspective. I had a great worship today. I enjoyed church today. And we don't really talk about the community. So if we are to deal with the matter at hand, which is a regress of where our society is, make America, 1950 again. If we're going to deal with that, then we have to begin to understand, I'm a clergy person, so I have to begin to understand what is my prophetic preaching. And let me back up. Do I preach prophetically? In other words, do I preach for such a time as this to the people and not worry about whether the people felt really, really good and left, feeling, this was just, I was so blessed. Or do they leave inspired by the Christian doctrine that says that we are community, that we do love one another, that we do care for ourselves. And when we don't, this is the consequence. This is what happens. We don't want to deal with we're living in the consequences, but we haven't dealt with it in our churches. And we haven't dealt with what Dr. Joy DeGruy calls the post-traumatic slave syndrome. So we got people walking around here in church and in our communities who still are wrestling with the oppressions that they have been dealt with since the beginning of time. So until we unpack some of that as a Christian body, then we're going to continue to have issues of race, issues of economic inequality, issues of LGBTQ inequality. The list can go on and on. And so I'm not one, I agree with Dr. Wilson, but I just push harder on the clergy because they have a different level of responsibility to the people who sit in the pews and to the communities in which they sit. Many have become accommodationists. Yes. They're like, well, I don't want to upset anything because the revenue stream that I get through this church, I need for X, Y, and Z.
And there are people sitting in the audience who have a certain expectation of what the message is going to be.
Oh, absolutely. Exactly. Because when you see a Trayvon Martin, when you see a Walter Scott, when you see you fill in the blank, Sandra Bland, we could sit here for hours and call the roll. And those situations have happened Monday through Saturday. And you come to church Sunday and not a word is mentioned. Not even that person who was brutalized or killed by the police. That name is not even mentioned. Right. Quite frankly, I wouldn't even go back to that church.
Right.
And you can preach love.
Exactly.
You can preach love. If your sermon was about love, you can preach it, but let your illustrations be about how do we present love in a world that's so full of hate.
Exactly.
How do we treat the biblical text? And this is one I've been working with, and my pastor has been helping me sift through it. Right. In the book of Philemon, this whole notion that the slave Onesimus has run away or sent away, I would argue run away, to meet with Paul. And then Paul says, and I get the historical context in which we must understand this because we were living in the Roman Empire. I get that. But Paul, in his privilege of being both Roman and Jew, sends him back and says, writes a nice letter to Philemon and says, look, we had a conversation. He did some things he shouldn't have done. He's our brother in Christ because, there's no Jew, there's no Greek. But when he goes back, hear me now. When he goes back to prison, I want you to treat him right. When he goes back to that position of poverty, I want you to, we could do better for him, but I'm going to send him back into those conditions. That is a text that we have to treat differently. We cannot preach the text that, Onesimus is our brother now, so all we got to do is love him. No, we love him and get him out of that condition. And I think,
I think if you look at that text, it was not just to Philemon to return to the same level of bondage that he left. It was also a challenge to the person that had him in bondage in the first place. The challenge was for him to treat him differently and to treat him as a brother, not as a slave, as an equal, not as a subordinate. And so I think many people have preached the text improperly, and as a result, we interpret the Bible to fit that the way we want it to fit. 90% of the churches on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America.
No, I don't say that again.
And it is because we have failed as faith leaders. We do not even worship together.
No, and I don't. But no. What I'm not saying I disagree. My point.
What I'm saying. Yeah. I'm saying.
No. I want to lift up your point where you said that because you lifted up a good point that in the treatment of the text we say that he is even encouraging Philemon to treat him differently, treat him as a brother, and that's one piece of the interpretation. But my argument is. We send people back to the same conditions in the hopes that the oppressor will treat them differently. And while I cannot change the historical context of Paul and Philemon and Onesimus, all I'm arguing is that we have to consider that when people find a way to escape whatever it is that oppresses them, that we help them continue down that road while we address how those who are oppressing them must continue to treat them as brothers and sisters. That's all I'm saying. And you may be saying something similar, but that was my point.
Dr. Sandy?
I think the challenge we have is we have to fight to change the conditions that give rise to the slavery or the inequities in the first place. Oftentimes, we will simply say a prayer and not deal with the systemic problems that cause the condition.
Right.
We look at poverty. It's not just that I'm poor today. There are some systems in place that keep me in poverty. There's, I don't have access to capital. I don't have access to transportation for employment. I don't have access to the education and training that I need. I mean, there are just so many things. And racism is a pervasive problem in America. It was then, it is now. And oftentimes the church uses the pulpit to make people at ease in Zion, and not allow them to see how they have the power to change the conditions under which they live. And so I think that as the faith leaders have a great obligation to speak truth to power. But if you go to, as you said, to 100 churches this coming Sunday, they don't talk about anything. They just make you feel good. Praise the Lord, thank you, Jesus, and all is well, and it's not.
Dr. Sandy?
From a psychological perspective, one of the things we know that is happens to, for example, women in domestic violence situations is the more passive a woman becomes, the worse the violence becomes. And there's a lesson for all of us in that we've got to stand up. We can no longer be passive. We can no longer turn the other cheek. We have to fight back. It's not a luxury today anymore. It's never been a luxury, but especially for white people, we can't turn up what's going on.
Silence Silence empowers the oppressor.
You got it.
And that, by not saying anything, by not, acknowledging when you hear something, something that's racist or sexist or ist, and saying, hey, that's not right. Let's change the narrative on that. You become a part of the oppression. You co-sign for the things. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Dr. Sandy and Pastor Paul, you've been very active in the fight. Have you experienced any racism as a result of your efforts? There were some comments on here about wanting to hear from you all and some of your experience.
I have one. It's a humdinger. So, all right, I'm this little naive white girl, right? And an agency as a counselor. I was the director of the counseling program. This was in DeKalb. We had a counselor who signed so we could serve people in the deaf community. We had hired a biracial woman. We had hired a black counselor. And we asked the local mental health board that gets government money if we could have some monies to get the word out in underserved communities that we had these services available. And so I wrote a grant, and we went to the state to plead our case. And there was one black man who wasn't there that night. And my boss and I are sitting there, and the chairman of the board says, this is in the late 90s, says, I can't believe you're asking us to take money from white people to give it to black people.
Wow.
That was my first in-my-face experience with institutional racism. And my boss, who's also white, we left there and looked, and I felt so bad. She called me back and she said, I am so sorry you went through that. I said, are you kidding me? I didn't go through anything.
Right.
And then I got bored because I almost cost them a member. And I go back to Maya Angelou, who said, sometimes you do the right thing because it's the right thing. And that, for me, fighting for that grant, we continued to fight for it. We got a little bit of money, nothing significant, but it shattered my naivete about race in this country.
Yeah. And I love when Obama took office, how they thought racism was over.
Yeah.
And I said, just you wait, right? It's a great step on many levels, but the color of the skin of the president of the United States does not change the mindsets of so many people in our country and the systematic racism that we've experienced. Someone said, my friend, she said, you don't have to change that which you don't acknowledge.
Right.
And part of it is making sure that people acknowledge and pay attention, because now with the new presidency, right, we're forced to acknowledge what's going on because people just can't help teeming over with racism. And regardless of who you voted for, I think you acknowledge objectively that the presidency has brought out divisive, racist behaviors, and that's something that needs to be addressed. That's something that we need to respond to.
Let me make a comment about, I've never been treated this way. At least I don't think so. I'm white and I'm male. And one of the things that I guess Dr. Martin Luther King movement and that movement brought out in me was the fact that if you're privileged, you'd advocate. Okay. And you have to. And so I remember when I was in seminary, it was the migrant workers and boycotting lettuce and all that kind of thing. When I was in the seminary in Chicago, it was redlining that's happening in Chicago. So I was out in front protesting at some realtors and getting thrown in the police paddy wagon or something like that. But I did not see that as, racist or I didn't see that. I saw that as something I knew was going to happen if I did it. And that was just the thing to do. I went down to Springfield when they were talking about not gay marriage, but just gay unions, and went down and testified down in Springfield. As a pastor in a congregation, people, thought, geez, you kind of thing. I said, but people are sacred.
Right.
and so I never had anyone hit me. I never had anyone, call me terrible names. I did, but that's all right.
I've always apologized.
Yeah. but I think that when you have privilege, you just can't sit there.
That's right.
You have to advocate for others.
Audre Lorde, who was a writer and a feminist, and just I love some of the stuff that she's written, but she talked about, one of the things that she talked about is that few people can truly understand experiences outside of their own. So men don't understand or take for granted the experiences that women go through. White people take for granted the experiences that people of color go through. Heteros take for granted the experiences that homosexual people go through. And I think that that's so important to start acknowledging, right, the experience of others and standing up for people, not just because it's a part of your own agenda, because of like what Dr. Sandy said and what others have said. It's just the right thing to do.
And I'd like to say something about white privilege. And I know it makes white people uncomfortable. And a lot of times we don't feel all that privileged in our society, that quite frankly, income inequality has oppressed all of us at this point. We're all suffering, right? But white privilege, it doesn't mean that because I'm not on the upper echelons of the income that I don't have privileges because I'm white. For example, when I was working in DeKalb, one of my colleagues was telling me that there was no place in DeKalb that she could get black hair done. There was no stylist for that. You couldn't buy makeup for black skin. You couldn't buy pantyhose that would match black women. That's DeKalb, where one of the second largest university in Illinois is at. So eye-opening for me. Or one of the colleagues who always drove with a video camera. This is before cell phones, because of driving while black. That exists. That's not made up. People are scared. We see it every day. And for me to accept that and look at that and say, because of my whiteness, I don't have to deal with that. It doesn't take anything away from my brothers and sisters are suffering because of racism.
As a result. Yeah.
And it doesn't, I'm not going to lose privilege, right? Because I'm white. I need to share privilege. I need to accept that this racism is going on. And it's not a threat to me to say, yeah, I have privileges because I'm white. I never worry about going out the door and thinking, how's it going to be to face the world today as a black woman? I've never had to think that. I bet you have.
Or a loan application when you walk into the bank.
Oh, yeah.
And the assumptions that are made.
We have 3 sons. We never talked to them about how you behave with the police.
Let me tell you something. That conversation still goes on today.
I've heard it in my office.
And I think, though, because you have privilege, you have also an obligation to use your privilege to expand the opportunities for those who don't have privilege.
Right.
I mean, I went to school with in a majority institution, and so I could not clean myself up, comb my hair, and put on clothes on Parents' Weekend and change who I was. Students could stop looking like a hippie, cut hair, fix hair, dress up, and then they could then be my boss upon graduation, just based on privilege alone. And so it's great to feel sorry for me, but it's even better when you act to change the conditions that give you an edge over me,
right,
in terms of the redlining of the mortgages or fighting for equity in promotions and equity in pay and equity in positions. I mean, I walk out of college with a degree in chemistry. I get hired at a company. They hired me as a senior technician and had me working side by side with a white male who had a high school diploma. And so when I realized what happened, and then a young white boy graduates and gets hired 2 weeks after me, he's immediately made a junior chemist. I had to fight to have an equal position and equal pay. With all things being equal, they immediately made me equal to somebody with less education and less experience. And so those are the kinds of situations where those with the privilege have to say, this is not right. I shouldn't have to fight that fight by myself. And, I think that's the kind of conversation we have to have. The white people in the Congress are not fighting for equity. In the United States Congress.
We've only got
King wrote that letter from the Birmingham jail, it was to the white church. How can you allow these injustices to exist and say absolutely nothing? I mean, that's the thing. It's easy to be brothers and sisters when you don't put anything at, you're not putting yourself at risk. Your comfort zone is not, your comfort is not in jeopardy, even though mine is. And I think of discussions and actions that Viola Liuzzo and some others had in the Dr. King years, that we are not witnessing the same kind of commitment today.
We've only got a few more minutes, but in closing, what is one thing that you want to stress when it comes to Martin Luther King and the changes to make the dream actually come to fruition, to come alive, and what we can do better today? Anybody?
I probably would like to stress the coalition method, right? The coalition of young people. Everything that I've watched, it was really about the young people and getting the momentum. And I have a son who sometimes challenges whether change can actually happen. And I remind him it was his age group that caused this change. So
King was 39.
26 when he entered the movement.
26 when he entered the movement.
25 at his first
and
church.
even though some of the ones at the lunch counter, et cetera, were teenagers. And in parting, I'd say, when you look at the Never Again movement, and understanding the place of privilege in there and acknowledging it, and developing a coalition of people of color and different backgrounds, and not being afraid of the consequences of demanding change. Young people, I think, I cannot say it more strongly, if we can get their eye towards understanding that they will be the change that this country wants to see, because if not, we will stand still in 1950 again.
Until it happens. Anybody else briefly?
I'd love to see women be part of that cohort. Women are rising. Their voices are being heard. And we consider a path forward that's not episodic, but is strategic and sustaining.
I believe that we have to really have this rainbow coalition of conscience to move the agenda forward today.
That's a great point.
And I believe we can and we must. We have to complete the unfinished items on Dr. King's agenda.
Amen.
He wasn't dreaming. He was very focused on
I
the
think
change.
The one thing he gave us really was courage. So you watch those scenes and the attacks by the dogs and the water hoses. They survived it, and we can survive it. And we have to be willing to have courage and put our necks out.
Yeah.
Not to be shy and quiet anymore. It's that the price is too high.
Yes.
Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate all of you. You could have been in the pulpit, but you came out with me tonight. So I thank you for being here. Once again, we're sponsored by GH Private Wealth Management Incorporated, 800-558-9769. Next week on Dana Being Dana, The Real Housewives of Naperville was our second highest rated show to date. And I had the mayor of Naperville call in and surprise my friends. So it's time to bring the mayor of Naperville into the show. They will be here next week, and we will actually be live on location in Naperville and celebrating Naperville and some of my favorite people in Naperville. So we're going to find out all about the amazing work that they're doing. Please tune in. And please check us out. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Thank you for sharing. I can't say enough about Martin Luther King and just embracing diversity. Diversity is a part of my life. So many of my friends and family are diverse. And I just think that love is the only way to bring about change in this world. Love over. Thank you. Good night. Thank you.